Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, and a big shout out to Mackenzie Patterson from Quill Podcasting, who appeared on my Google alerts the other day because they recently featured us on their top 10 tech podcast list. And they said, tune into this podcast for thought-provoking examples of how tech is transforming industries, as well as a few actionable tips on how to take advantage of emerging technologies and overcome any challenges that you might be facing. Listen in for enlightening conversations on navigating the tech industry and the latest tips, tricks and trends. So a huge thank you to Mackenzie for not only listening to the podcast, but for taking the time to include us in that list in the article that she wrote. And remember, if you leave a review of the podcast, send me a screenshot. I'll give you a shout out on the show. But on with today's show. And today I'm excited to speak with Lauren Woodman, a Tech for Good veteran who was recently announced as the CEO of a company called DataKind. Now, DataKind is a global non-profit organisation that leverages data science in the service of humanity. And that is the kind of story that I try and champion on this podcast every day. And they are unique for pushing the boundaries of what is possible when social and humanitarian causes leverage advanced technology to enact positive change in the world. And she also has over 25 years of experience in the technology and non-profit sectors, including roles of congressional liaison at the UN and GM of Microsoft's global education programs. And more recently, she was also the CEO of NetHope, where she was awarded $190 million in technology capabilities and infrastructure to humanitarian organisations. And that is what this show is all about. So between me and you, I'm incredibly excited to get Lauren on here and learning the difference she's making with technology to make a real difference in the world. But enough spoilers from me. Buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Seattle, Washington, where you can join me and Lauren in conversation. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Lauren. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Thanks, Neil. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm Lauren Woodman. I'm based in Seattle. I'm the CEO of DataKind, which is a global nonprofit that harnesses the power of data science and AI in the service of humanity. I've spent my last 25 years working at the intersection of tech and development and policy. And it's great to end up in a place like DataKind where I can really focus on these emerging technologies.
Well, I'm looking forward to finding more about how you do just that. But before we do, I want to take you back way before DataKind and ask you to share your origin story and where your passion for tech came from, or was it something that lit the spark in you? And tell the listeners that moment that put you on this path that you're on today.
Thanks. It's funny to think back so long. When I started my professional career, my real interest was international development policy. And that was what I was sort of grounded in. But at the time, like many young folks, I took the first job I could find, which was in science policy, which ultimately turned into tech policy just as the internet was beginning. And back when we were really starting to put in place some of the rules that governed the internet, especially at the international level. And tech and economic development policy, especially at the international level, are inherently intertwined. And I've really never looked back. And the thing that fascinated me about technology, especially in thinking about international development, is so much changes constantly. And with all of the challenges that we have in international development, the thought of bringing new approaches, new business models, new scientific breakthroughs against those problems, some of which seem really intractable, really became just a real passion for me. And I've spent the last several decades, working at that intersection, trying to move that needle.
I love that. And it was that path that led you to DataKind, which, for people hearing about it for the first time, is a global non-profit organisation that actually leverages data science in the service of humanity. And one of the things I always say on this Daily Tech podcast is technology works best when it brings people together. So that's one of the reasons that I invited you on today. But can you tell me a little bit more about how you're pushing the boundaries and leveraging advanced technology to enact positive change in the world? Because it's something we don't hear enough about. We often hear about the world of technology moving fast and breaking things, but not making that positive change in the world. So can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, and I think you're right, in the sense that technology can be a really powerful tool for good. And we really want to see that come to fruition in this space of data science and AI. Look, mission-driven organizations all over the world, are trying to reduce poverty, eliminate inequality, address healthcare issues, make the world a more fair and more safe place for everyone. And the social sector, the nonprofits around the world that are driven by these missions, need the same tools that the private sector has in order to advance the work that they do and to address these really difficult challenges. But they rarely have the resources to hire or even fully deploy off-the-shelf solutions. And they certainly don't have the resources to, hire full-time data scientists and do things at the same level that the private sector does. And so at DataKind, we try and bring those advances and people who want to support mission-driven organizations together with organizations that are trying to address these global challenges. And so what does that mean? We team data sciences and AI experts up with nonprofits against a particular problem to help an organization address a challenge that they're facing. We get volunteers from all across the private sector, not surprisingly from tech companies, where a lot of our data scientists volunteers come from. And we help build those solutions, and then we stick around to make sure that they're being actively deployed. Over the last 10 years, we've done more than 350 projects. That's about, $35 million or so in pro bono services. And so we're trying to bring those resources that the private sector has into the nonprofit sector. And we're trying to make sure that data science and AI can live in the nonprofit sector in a way that advances the missions and the achievements that these organizations are trying to reach.
And it's a fascinating subject when we talk about data now, because if we look at the world of big business, data has gone from the biggest asset to the biggest liability with regulations and increasing number of cyber attacks, etc. And then we've got the social media and what they're doing with data. But what interests me about what you're doing here is this data for good movement. So can you tell me a little bit more about exactly what the data for good movement is and ultimately where it's heading to?
Yeah, and I think you've touched on a couple of issues that are really of concern to people all over the world, right? And technology and data are inherently neutral. It's how we deploy them against the challenges or the problems that we're facing. And, I really feel like I've been at DataKind, for several months now, and I feel like I've joined at a pivotal time because we really want to make sure that as data science and AI continue to be deployed against all sorts of issues around the world, that we are doing that in a way that is transparent and ethical and is helping organizations achieve their missions and more people to be able to benefit from these advances in technology rather than being exclusionary or used for nefarious purposes. And we've seen a huge explosion in the use of AI just during the COVID pandemic. I mean, PwC recently had a survey that more than half of companies had accelerated their use of AI during COVID at the same point in time where you see nonprofits being really resource strapped, even as the demand for their services go up. So we see this disconnect between what's happening in the private sector and what's happening with mission-driven organizations. And the Data for Good movement is really focused on helping to bridge that gap and make sure that these organizations that have historically been under-resourced in these areas can have the same access to these tools that can help us solve some of these tough problems.
And to bring everything we're talking about to life for people listening all over the world, are there any data projects that DataKind is working on, and how you're using technology to make that social impact that you could possibly share with everyone? I appreciate you might not be able to mention any names, but is there anything that springs to mind?
Well, I mean, this is where the work gets super exciting, right? I mean, this is the good stuff. It all sounds lovely in theory. It's when we can bring it to life. So let me see if I can give you a couple of examples. One is an organization that we worked with in Africa called Writers for Health. And Writers for Health takes medical samples for diagnosis, often from very remote communities, right? And brings them back to labs and medical facilities for testing so that the right interventions can be made for individuals who may be living far outside, of a medical facility that is within easy access. And we worked with them to help them speed up that process. When the writers actually go out, they track everything by hand in their logbooks. And because of the amount of time that it takes to pull all of that data together, it was taking 60 days to figure out sort of where people had been and what samples had been dropped off with whom and so on and so forth. But by using data science and AI techniques in order to translate those handwritten records into machine readable, we could get that down to under a day. And you can imagine the difference that it means for healthcare when you can reduce diagnostics from 60 days to a single day. We worked with the water district in California to help them save dollars around capital storage costs because of the drought. The Multinagal Water District serves about 170,000 people across Southern California, where we all know droughts have been awful over the last several years. The water district needed a way to accurately forecast water demand so that it could improve pricing, expand conservation programs, and increase the efficiency of water transportation throughout its network. And so we created a data infrastructure and some dashboards to predict customer demand more accurately, which ultimately resulted in the agency saving $25 million so they didn't have to store water that wasn't needed. Wow. And we worked locally here in the United States to help reduce the risk of kids dropping out of college. And so we worked with John Jay College here in New York City. Well, I should say there in New York City, to identify students that were at risk of dropping out so that this college could have interventions to support those kids sooner and increase the graduation rate. We actually looked at 10 years worth of data. And because of that, increased the graduation rate from 54% to 73%. So there's lots of different ways that we've done very specific projects. We've also taken a look a little bit more broadly. And as we, over the years, have done many of these projects, we've actually put together a playbook around, ways to address and run data science projects for nonprofits to use that is available to any nonprofit that wants to use it. And our UK chapter has actually put together a handbook on ethics to help organizations think about data ethics as they are deploying projects. So we work with very specific organizations against very discrete problems, but also takes that learning and then share that out more broadly so that everyone can benefit from these advancements.
I love what you're doing here. And if I was to go back even further, I was doing a little research before you came on the podcast today, and I quickly learned that it's not your first rodeo, and you were the CEO at NetHope, where you were awarded $190 million in technology capabilities and infrastructure to humanitarian organisations. So I'm curious, can you tell me a bit more about your experience there as a pioneer in the tech policy and non-profit space, and how that went on to help you make the difference that you're making today?
Well, thank you for flagging that, because I think it's foundational. And NetHope is a great organization. I loved my time at NetHope, and our work was really around catalyzing nonprofits to work collaboratively with software companies so that they could bring basic software capabilities into nonprofits. Now, NetHope is a little bit older than DataKind, and when the organization started, and even when I joined, it was not still a given that digital transformation, which was happening all across the private sector, it was all we were talking about in the private sector, but that really hadn't permeated into the nonprofit space yet. And so we spent a lot of time working with these large nonprofits to identify what digital transformation really looks like for a large multinational nonprofit, and how what we've learned in the private sector might be ported and adapted for use in those organizations. And I think it's one of the reasons I was so interested in what's happening at DataKind. When I joined NetHope, I don't know, almost a decade ago, we were really at that cusp of digital transformation in the nonprofit space. And it was wonderful to see the organization embrace that, and its member organizations really wrap their arms around what that looks like. But one of the things that nonprofits everywhere are still struggling with is the plethora of data that's available, how to make use of it, and then how to bring these advanced data techniques, data science, AI, machine learning, into the world of nonprofits. Very different opportunities, very different challenges, but similar in that we are trying to take what is available to others and leverage it in the nonprofit and the social sector so that everyone can benefit.
Well, I think right now technology often gets in the headlines for all the wrong reasons, with everything from surveillance and tracking and data harvesting, etc. But I'd love to try and restore the balance in the universe a little bit and ask you, what is it that excites you about harnessing the power of data science and artificial intelligence, but in the service of humanity? Because that's where the real exciting stuff is happening, isn't it?
It is. It is really exciting. And I think it is the potential that is always so interesting to me. And DataKind is uniquely positioned to help bridge that gap between hope and reality. We've talked about data in the social sector for decades, but a lot of that data is stagnant. It's difficult to unlock. We don't have the expertise that we need to really gain the insights that we need. And the thing I think that excites me the most is these tools are easily accessible with some expertise. And we have 20,000 volunteers over the years that have showed up to say, how do we help nonprofits get access to that information, those insights that will help them improve and accelerate reaching their missions? And that is what is so exciting. It is not easy on a one-to-one level for any one nonprofit to find, one person to help them. To bring that stuff in-house is sometimes almost impossible. But for an organization like DataKind and all of our chapters around the world to help provide that connectivity, between those that want to help and those that need the help, along with that expertise, and then be able to share that information more broadly, that's the bridge that we need. And that's really, really exciting when you think about the potential of all of the good that can come out of that.
So I'm curious, what are your biggest challenges and obstacles right now in building that bridge that we're talking about here? Is there anything you can share around that?
Yeah, I think, I work for a nonprofit. There's always a million challenges. But let's set aside the usual challenges of working with a nonprofit, along with, frankly, all of the benefits that come with that and feeling good about the work that you do every day. I think the biggest challenge that collectively we face, around this ability to use data science and AI more effectively is the capacity to absorb these types of technologies in the social sector. A lot of organizations, both big and small, are really still struggling with the right infrastructure, the right tools, the right demand, the right interest from making the investments necessary to leverage these tools. And so it is a big challenge for nonprofits to take on something, to become a data-driven organization. It's not the most obvious path. It's quite often not supported by donors. Often it's hard to get the type of leadership or or board of directors buy-in to do the work that's necessary. It does require sometimes, a change in the way organizations operate, and all of those kinds of things, which are easily addressed in the private sector. And I say easily on a relative scale, because change management is never easy, but it's certainly easier in the private sector than it is in the nonprofit sector. All of those things in the nonprofit sector are challenged just because of the way that nonprofits are resourced. And so the capacity for nonprofits to be able to take a moment, think about what they need, make the right investments, and then build upon the success that they've had with one or two initial projects is really the biggest challenge that we face.
So what's your big focus going to be this year? And an even bigger question, I suppose, is what is your grand vision for DataKind?
Peace and love around the world and harmony for everybody. That's where we want to get to. But that's, I think that's probably true for all of us in this sector. I think you'll see us focus on a couple of places in the short to medium term future, which is really looking at partnerships. Just as DataKind can't solve all of these problems on its own, even with our incredible volunteers and our incredible nonprofit partners, we really do need to focus on broadening the range of organizations with which we work, so that we've got more expertise, greater resources, and a better understanding of both what is possible and how we might achieve that. So you'll see us working more closely with chapters around the world. You'll see us working with the private sector. You'll see us working with new foundations, all of those types of things to really construct the ecosystem that is necessary to make sure that data science and AI are being used effectively in the nonprofit sector. And I think as this is our 10th year anniversary, right? So we've been around for 10 years, and we're very much looking forward to, what does that next 10 years look like? And our goal over these, next decade or so is to really think about how do we help nonprofits see data science and AI as a must-have in their day-to-day operations, and get the support that they need in order to have data science and AI be a given in their operations and not a nice to have.
Well, I wish you the best of luck on your journey. It'd be great to keep in touch with you and see where it's heading. But before I let you go, we began the podcast talking about your origin story, what put you on this path. And as we come full circle, I want to ask if there was a song, piece of music, movie or book that has inspired, accompanied you or helped you in your career in any way. What would you choose and why? And we'll add it to our list.
Yeah, that's a great question and a really, really hard one, right? Because there's so many of them. But I think, a book that I have read over and over and over again was Dave Eggers' first novel, A Staggering Work of Heartbreaking Genius, which is both one of the funniest and most depressing books I've ever read. But the thing that struck me about that book was, and the thing that I think has resonated with me all these years, is that there was this sort of seminal event early in the book that changed everything that he expected to happen in his life. And for me, having sort of set out on this path, in international development and, thinking I was going to spend my life in the Peace Corps, changing water filters in far-flung places, to this sort of very radical shift to, really sort of from very basic human needs to very cutting edge technologies and how we bring those two together. His transition through that book of, how do you take a step back, reset your expectations and then thrive in a new environment has always been something that has really resonated with me. And I've probably read that book a dozen times and just love it.
Oh man, well, I love that choice. I'll get that added to our Amazon list as well, so other listeners can find that nice and easily. But for anyone listening that wants to find out more information about anything we talked about today or contact your team at DataKind, what's the best starting point?
Best starting point is with our website at datakind.org. And from there, you can also find a link to our UK chapter for all of your listeners in the UK, and as well as our chapters around the world. But datakind.org is the place to start.
Well, as I said at the very beginning of this podcast, the big theme is technology works best when it brings people together. So I love what you're doing here and pushing the boundaries of what is possible when social and humanitarian causes leverage advanced technology and able to enact positive change in the world. We don't get to hear enough stories like this out there. All too often, we only get to hear the dark side of technology. So I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to come on here and share your story. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the evening.
A huge thank you to Lauren for talking about the future of Data for Good movement, the current projects that they've got, and how DataKind is working on using artificial intelligence solutions to make a social impact and making a real difference in the world with technology. And I think her experience as a pioneer in the tech policy and non-profit space is just invaluable. And I feel genuinely grateful that she took the time to sit down and share those experiences with us today, because there's just so much gold in the things that she was talking about. And it's my hope that technology will enable you all to listen to this podcast anywhere in the world. Maybe it'll spark a few ideas, and maybe you'll go on and make positive change in the world by leveraging technology. If you've got a story to share of how you're going to do that, or something that you believe in, I built this platform so you can sit down with me and share that story too. So as always, email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn at Neil C. Hughes. My website is techblogwriter.co.uk, where you'll find nearly 2,000 interviews and how you can work with me if you'd like to spend even longer with me. But I appreciate a daily tech podcast is probably more than enough for you. But come and join me again tomorrow. We'll do it all again. But thank you for listening, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.